Somewhere on the west coast of an island about the size of Maryland, there is a building. Inside it, machines that each cost more than an airport carve patterns into silicon thinner than a virus. And almost everything you own that runs on a battery, the phone in your pocket, the laptop you are watching this on, the car you keep complaining about the price of, the data center answering your questions right now, depends on that building, and a dozen more just like it, sitting on the same island, 90 miles from a country that says the island belongs to it. This is Taiwan. On a map, it looks minor. It is not in the G7. It ranks somewhere in the 20s for population. Most people could not find it in under 5 seconds. And yet, if this one island stopped working for a single year, the global economy would not slow down. It would seize. So, this is the only question worth asking about a place like this. Where does the money actually come from? Where does it actually go? And what happens the day it stops? Welcome to the autopsy. Start with what Taiwan sells, because it is not what you would guess. It is not gadgets. Taiwan does not get rich shipping you a finished phone. It gets rich making the one part inside the phone that nobody else on Earth can make as well: chips. The most advanced chips, specifically. And even more specifically, one company makes most of them: Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. A name most people have never said out loud, attached to a company that, in October 2024, briefly became the 8th most valuable company on the planet, worth more than Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett spent 70 years building his empire. A contract chip factory from a science park in Hsinchu walked straight past it, because it makes the thing the AI boom physically cannot run without. The scale is hard to hold in your head. In 2025, TSMC pulled in around $122 billion and took roughly 70% of the entire global market for made-to-order chips. Its closest competitor, Samsung, the company that probably made your TV and your fridge, took about 7%. That is not a lead. That is a company in a different weight class, politely pretending the other fighters are in the ring. And when you narrow it to the chips that actually matter, the cutting-edge ones that run AI and the newest phones, TSMC makes more than 90% of them. 9 out of every 10 of the most advanced processors in the world come off production lines on one island. The chip inside the graphics card training the chatbot. The chip inside your next phone. The chip inside a fighter jet. Same island. Often the same handful of buildings. People like to say chips are the new oil. That undersells it. Oil comes out of the ground in dozens of countries, and if one field has a bad year, you buy from somewhere else. The most advanced chip on Earth comes from almost entirely one place, made by almost entirely one company, using machines built by almost entirely one other company in the Netherlands. It is less like oil, and more like the entire world running on a spice that only grows in one garden. And what does advanced even mean here? A modern chip is a sliver of silicon smaller than your fingernail with tens of billions of microscopic switches carved into it, packed so tightly the wiring between them is measured in atoms. The whole industry is a decades-long race to make those switches smaller, because smaller means more of them in the same space, which means more computing for less power. TSMC has been the company that gets there first for years now. When Apple wants next year's phone to feel faster, or Nvidia wants a chip that can train a smarter model, the honest answer to who can actually build that is a very short list with one name at the top. So how does one island end up owning the single most important step in making the modern world? Not by accident and not by luck. By a government decision most governments would have been far too impatient to make. Back in 1973, Taiwan was making cheap plastics and textiles, and its officials looked at that and decided it was a dead end. They set up a research institute, licensed chip-making know-how from an American firm called RCA, yes, the same RCA that made your grandparents' radio, and quietly trained a generation of engineers. Then, in 1987, a US-trained executive named Morris Chang, who had spent decades at Texas Instruments and been passed over for the top job, came home and started TSMC on an idea everyone thought was boring. The idea was this: chip companies back then both designed their chips and built them. The way a restaurant both writes the menu and cooks the food. Chang said, "I will not design a single thing. I will only build. Send me your blueprint. I will manufacture your chip better than you can, and I will never compete with you or steal it. A pure factory, nothing else." The whole industry saw the low status, boring end of the business. It turned out to be the choke point. Because building a leading-edge chip factory is arguably the hardest, most expensive manufacturing that exists. A single new one can cost $20 billion, which is roughly the price of 10 of the world's tallest skyscrapers, takes years to build, and loses money on every wafer if your precision is even slightly off. Almost nobody on Earth can do it. So the world's best chip designers, Apple, Nvidia, all of them, gave up building their own factories and started lining up at Taiwan's door. TSMC does the impossible part. They just do the drawing. That one decision is now most of Taiwan's economy. Depending on how you count, semiconductors are somewhere between 15 and 20% of the island's entire GDP and around 60% of everything it sells abroad. One industry, more than half of a developed country's exports. Picture 6 out of every $10 America earned overseas coming from a single product, and that product being made mostly by one company. And now the detail that makes the whole thing tense. The single biggest buyer of Taiwan's chips is China, the country that calls Taiwan a breakaway province and has said repeatedly that it will take the island back one day. In 2023, mainland China bought more than half of Taiwan's semiconductor exports. The neighbor that wants to absorb Taiwan is also its best customer, which is a little like being in a bidding war and a custody battle with the same person at the same time. And you might reasonably ask, so what? If these chips are this valuable, why doesn't China just build its own factories? Or the United States? Or anyone with enough money to try? They are trying. They are failing, or at best crawling, and the reason is the most underrated fact in this entire story. A leading-edge chip factory is not a thing you can buy. It is 30 years of accumulated knowledge that does not fit in any manual. It is thousands of engineers who each know one impossibly specific thing, working next to the suppliers who feed them exotic chemicals and parts, all clustered so tightly a problem gets solved over lunch instead of over 3 weeks of email. You cannot wire a country a check and receive that. China has spent well over $100 billion trying to build a homegrown industry and still cannot make the most advanced chips at scale, partly because the single most important machine, the one from that Dutch company that prints the finest patterns with light, is effectively banned from being sold to it. The United States invented the semiconductor, let its own leading-edge manufacturing quietly rot, and is now paying tens of billions to try to drag it back, and even that will take years to match what Taiwan already does on an ordinary Tuesday. That is the real moat, not a patent, not a secret formula. 30 years of an entire society getting very good at one brutally difficult thing, in one place, faster than anyone else could catch up. Money can buy you a factory. It cannot buy you the 3 decades. Now, the counterintuitive part, the one most explanations skip right before it gets interesting. You would assume that making 90% of the world's best chips means keeping 90% of the money in chips. It does not. Taiwan makes almost all of the advanced hardware and holds a surprisingly thin slice of the total value. By one US government estimate, Taiwan captures around 10% of the value created across the entire global chip industry. It makes 90% of the hardware and keeps roughly 10% of the value. That gap is the whole point. So where does the rest of the money go? It pools upstream in the parts you never see. It goes to the American and British firms that design the chips, the blueprint owners like Nvidia and ARM, whose margins are enormous because an idea costs almost nothing to copy once you have it. It goes to the tiny handful of companies, most of them American, that make the software you need to design a chip in the first place. And it goes to one Dutch company, ASML, which builds the only machines on Earth capable of printing the finest patterns and charges the price of a passenger jet for every single one. So the map of the money looks strange. Taiwan does the single hardest physical step, the one nobody else can replicate, and takes a modest cut. The people who own the drawings and the tools get rich. It is the difference between owning the only bakery in town that can make the wedding cake and owning the recipe, the patent on the oven, and the only supply of flour. TSMC is the bakery. It works unbelievably hard and makes very good money, but it does not own the recipe. To be fair, TSMC is not being robbed. It is one of the most profitable manufacturers alive, with margins most factories can only fantasize about. The point is subtler and more interesting than Taiwan getting exploited. It is that even total dominance of the hardest, most physical step in an industry does not automatically hand you that industry's money. Wealth pools wherever the work is hardest to copy, and it turns out a brilliant design is harder to copy than a brilliant factory, because a factory, eventually, someone else can at least attempt to build. Taiwan bet the entire country on being the world's factory. It won that bet completely. It is now finding out exactly what that victory is and is not worth. Which brings us to the strangest asset Taiwan owns. It is not a chip or a factory or a pile of cash. It is a theory, and it has a name: the Silicon Shield. The idea, first argued by a journalist named Craig Addison back in 2001, runs like this. Taiwan is a small island next to a much larger country that wants it, which on paper is a terrifying place to be. But because Taiwan makes the chips the entire world economy runs on, including China's economy and including the American military, nobody can afford to see those factories destroyed or captured. The chips are so essential that they act as armor. Attack the island, and you do not simply start a war. You switch off the modern world's supply of its most critical component, your own supply very much included. The theory says the factories keep the peace, because everyone needs them intact far more than anyone needs to fight over them. It is an elegant idea, a country defending itself not with an army, but with an economic function so essential that damaging it would be suicide for the attacker. Taiwan is, in a real sense, too important to invade, and that status buys Taiwan something no army could. A small island most of the world will not formally call a country, living in the shadow of a giant, still gets courted by presidents, visited by senators, and quietly defended in the policy of nations that will not even open an embassy there. Not out of affection, out of need. When you make the one component the 21st century cannot run without, the world is forced to care whether you survive, whether it wants to or not. One scholar calls Taiwan a niche superpower, a place with almost no physical size and enormous leverage, because it holds a single indispensable industry. It is the geopolitical version of being the only mechanic in town who can fix the one car everybody drives. But sit with the shield idea one more second, because armor made of factories has an obvious flaw. The exact same fact that makes Taiwan too valuable to attack also makes it the single most valuable target on the map and the single biggest point of failure in the world economy. One island, a handful of buildings, 90% of the most advanced anything. The thing protecting Taiwan is the thing painting a giant target on it. And that armor only holds as long as the factories cannot be moved, cannot be copied, and cannot be switched off, which is exactly what the rest of the planet is now, frantically trying to change. So how does a shield like this actually break? 3 ways, and Taiwan is exposed on all 3. The first is the ground itself. Taiwan sits where 2 tectonic plates grind against each other, which is a polite way of saying the island shakes for a living. On April 3, 2024, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake, the strongest to hit Taiwan in 25 years, struck near the east coast, killed more than a dozen people, and toppled buildings. TSMC evacuated fabs, and the detail that tells you how fragile this precision is. The company later reported it had scrapped tens of millions of dollars of half-finished chips, not because the buildings failed, but because the shaking alone ruined wafers mid-production. A quake violent enough to kill people and collapse apartment blocks did not break the factories. It still cost a fortune, because at this level of precision, a hard enough vibration is enough to throw away the work. Now imagine a bigger one, closer to the fabs. The second way is water, and it is the vulnerability almost nobody sees coming. Making chips takes staggering amounts of ultra-pure water. A single large fab can drink around 20,000 tons a day, which is the daily water use of a town of nearly 60,000 people, and TSMC's southern sites use several times that. The trouble is that Taiwan, for all its rain, is one of the most water-stressed places in the developed world. In 2021, it hit its worst drought in more than half a century, after a year in which, for the first time in decades, not one typhoon showed up to refill the reservoirs. The government literally shut off irrigation water to rice farmers to keep the chip factories running, and TSMC started trucking water in by the tanker. A drought most of the planet never heard about came within a few dry months of throttling the supply of the product your entire digital life runs on. The third way is the one Taiwan cannot engineer around, and it is the money question turned into a weapon. Everyone else now understands the danger of a single island making everything, and everyone wants production moved off it. The United States passed a $52 billion law to lure chip factories onto American soil, and its own Commerce Secretary said out loud that Taiwan should move half of its chip making to the United States. TSMC has now committed over $100 billion to build fabs in Arizona, with more going up in Japan and Germany. And this is the trap sitting at the center of the entire story. The silicon shield only protects Taiwan for as long as the factories cannot leave. But the pressure from customers and from the risk itself is pushing Taiwan to spread those factories across the world, which slowly dissolves the one thing keeping it safe. Every fab Taiwan builds somewhere else to reassure the world makes the island a little less irreplaceable. It is being asked politely to hand out pieces of its own shield. Taiwan knows this, which is why it has kept its newest and best technology at home on purpose. Something like 90 to 95% of its most advanced manufacturing stays on the island, and the true cutting edge, the next generation, always gets built in Taiwan first. That is not sentiment, that is strategy. As long as the crown jewel exists only there, the shield holds. So the autopsy lands here. Taiwan is not rich because it is big or lucky or sitting on top of oil. It is rich and it is protected because 40 years ago, it decided to become the one place on Earth that could do the single hardest step in building the modern world you live in. And then it guarded that position like its survival depended on it, which it does. Its entire security rests on staying irreplaceable. And the whole planet, quietly, is spending hundreds of billions of dollars to make it replaceable. The chip on this island runs your world. The question no one has answered yet is which runs out first, the world's patience with depending on one island or the island's luck. Because there is a second choke point hiding directly underneath this one. Every chip, all that AI, all of it needs one more thing to actually run. And it is not silicon. It is power, city-sized, ever-growing amounts of electricity, and it is quietly becoming the fault line under the entire boom. That is the next autopsy.